So, if you're a Pokémon fan and haven't been living under some great proverbial rock for the last 6 months or so, you will no doubt be aware of the controversy surrounding the latest games in the series. For you rock dwellers, Sword and Shield are the first 8th generation Pokémon games, set to release tomorrow for Nintendo Switch, although footage from early copies has been circulating for a couple of days now. With me so far? I hope so, because all I've told you so far is a release date and a title, and shit is going to go a little deeper than that. Now, the problem / controversy / shitstorm goes thusly. Sword and Shield are to be the first core Pokémon games not to include every member of the ever-growing roster. I believe the leaked figures indicate that around 400 out of the total 903 monsters will be making an appearance, and for those of you who skipped your maths lessons, that means a little over half of the total Pokédex will be absent from this game. Alongside this, and perhaps because of this, the internet at large has been critical of the game's visuals, its lack of features, and its linearity, making it the most controversial thing to happen to Pokémon since that one anime episode which gave a load of kids seizures. Now, before we dig into the nitty gritty of this video, I want to make two things clear. Number one, if you're upset with the quality of a product, you are well within your rights to complain about it. I take zero issue with fans of the series wanting to voice their dissatisfaction with the latest entries, and I actively encourage people to do so. This video merely serves as my views on the subject, nothing more and nothing less. Number two, I speak here as someone with some degree of experience on the matter. While I am by no means an expert and have never worked as a professional game developer, I have worked as part of a team to develop games in both an academic and personal environment. I've contributed to games jams and have my fair share of knowledge when it comes to the development pipeline and the timescale involved when making a large-scale project such as Pokémon, so yeah, I'm no pro, but I'm also not pulling what I'm about to say completely out of my arse. Right, did that disclaimer do it for you? Do you feel suitably disclaimed? Good, then let's get on with it. Point numero uno. Pokémon Sword and Shield has had a horrifically short development cycle. I'm not one to jump to the defense of the big developer when they fail to deliver, but I am one to jump to the defense of individual developers. Note the S. I'm talking about the dudes who are busting their dicks day in and out to produce a video game of acceptable quality in the sort of time which a similar sized team would normally dedicate entirely to prototyping and idea generation. These guys have been grafting away to produce a highly anticipated game for unfamiliar hardware with what is undeniably the harshest deadline in the games industry, bearing in mind that the anime, card game, merchandise and god knows what else all hinge entirely on the timely launch of this game, so if it's not ready in time there will be absolute hell to pay. All this with a team of 143, a large portion of which will be working on the developer's other project, Little Town Hero. For contrast, Breath of the Wild had a 300 strong dev team and still took 5 years to make. Assuming 2/3 of Game Freak's employees are purely focused on Pokémon, then that's 1/3 of the team with 1/5 of the time compared to Zelda. And you see people asking why Sword and Shield aren't of the same quality as Breath of the Wild, presumably because they were born with a chocolate digestive for a brain. Let's step away from the bigger picture for a moment and look at some of the more specific niggles that people have with the game. The animation seemed to be a major cause for concern for a lot of people, with many pointing specifically to the rotating back and forth of the tail whip animation. Now, the first point I want to make here is that this isn't an animation, at least not in the classic sense. Rather than using a frame-by-frame animation file to handle this movement, the model is simply being rotated back and forth along a code-based timeline, and there is a very good reason for that. So, bear with me here. Half the Pokémon are gone, right? So we've got like 400 left, and around 600 of the total 728 moves. Now, with this pruned roster and move list, if Game Freak were to make an individual animation for each and every move on each and every Pokémon, that would be a total of 240,000 animations. Even factoring out the immense amount of disk space 240,000 animations would take up, you still need to bear in mind that a single high quality animation can take anything in the region of 2 to 5 hours to produce. Even on the conservative end, that's nearly 500,000 man-hours, or 57 years. Compare that to the roughly 10 lines of code which would be used to universally make every single Pokémon do that little back and forth tail whip wiggle. It's an absolute no-brainer. And once again, I want to clarify that I agree there are certain animation issues. The misplaced projectile spawn points which have Blastoise forget that it has cannons spring to mind, but even producing animation files to handle idle states, physical attacks, special attacks, taking damage and being knocked out for 400 Pokemon would have been a tall order given the time constraints. Without Dexit, that would have been doubled. And I guess that brings us to Dexit itself, or the Great Pokemon Purge as I like to call it. Now, for me this was never an issue, and I imagine that's the case for a whole bunch of other fans too. The game includes 400 odd capturable Pokémon, which is honestly more than most of the games have had. The issue, however, is that this time you can't trade across the inaccessible monsters from other games, and I get it, I really do. Some people like the catch 'em all aspect. Some super hardcore competitive players like having a larger pool of pokes to use. Some people just like to be able to use their old favourites in a new world, and it sucks that they can't do that anymore. But it had to happen eventually. The developers simply can't keep on updating models, textures and animations for an ever-growing pool of creatures like this, even if you ignore the challenge this poses regarding balance and file size. Including alternate forms, there's over 1,000 of the bastards now. There had to be a point where a line was drawn, and if it isn't now, it would be soon. I for one would rather the team focused on making a better game experience than dedicate months of development time to making sure people can still use Love Disc and Jinx. Now, therein lies the problem as I see it. I can accept that these sacrifices have to be made, but I'm perfectly happy to eat these words if I play the game tomorrow and it blows me away, but the gameplay experience that I just mentioned, that seems to be lacking too. The games are overly linear and uninspired, and while I understand why that's the case, and I'm desperate not to add to the septic hose of hate which these poor bastards at Game Freak are being blasted with, I feel like that is the issue which is stifling this franchise. Not Pokemon numbers, not visual quality, not failing to live up to the honestly pretty unreasonable expectations of the people who think every game should be GTA 5, but good old-fashioned limp dick game design. And it's an issue which has existed since long before Sword and Shield came along. So what's the solution? Well, that takes us back around full circle to development time. In order to be a huge visual and technical spectacle, they need more than a year in the pot. In order to be a super exciting, wondrous adventure, games need to be thoroughly planned and focus tested and iterated upon, not just hurriedly slapped together, daisy-chained into a game by overly talkative NPCs and then packaged off to the presses. This series needs a development cycle long enough to accommodate a massive RPG. I'm talking at least 3 years, and that is something a multi-billion-dollar franchise can easily afford. Except it can't, and it won't. Because yearly releases are the lifeblood of Pokémon at this point. The series has stayed so prevalent in the public eye for so long because it is permanently in the games charts, permanently on our kids' TV channels, permanently in stores and on billboards and beamed into our brains by Illuminati satellites. Wait, forget I said that last thing. But yeah, Pokémon needs to stay in the public eye in order to stay as big as it is, and it needs to stay as big as it is in order to continue lining the pockets of the shareholders and executives who pull the strings of the poor cubicle developers who I mentioned earlier. So, here's what I propose. If the game can't have more literal development time, it needs more man-hours. The team needs to double. More animators, more 3D modelers, more VFX artists, more designers to brainstorm interesting maps and involving side quests, more QA guys to pick up on the dodgy visuals and the aggravating design decisions, more people to take the formula we love and hammer it into something truly special. So by all means, boycott this game if you want to try and send a message, but try to make sure that message is the right one. It's not about pointless vapid statements like #GameFreakLied or #FuckGameFreak. It's definitely not about sending fucking death threats to the individuals who worked on the game, and if you've done that, believe me when I say you come across as nothing more than a mentally deficient meth-smoking fuckwit. It's about letting the boys in charge know that they can't keep on like this, and if they want to produce one of the biggest game franchises in history, then they need an adequate team to reflect that. I'm still buying it though.